Hello and welcome to the Botanical Biohacking Podcast. In this 5-part series, we will be covering the science of tongue diagnosis. Variations in oral microbiota have been observed with obesity, autoimmune disorders, and even various types of cancer. In this 5-part series, you will discover how tongue diagnosis works from a biological vantage point and why it may be one of the most elegant screening methods for detecting systemic changes to the human microbiome and neuroendocrine system. History and standardization. Written descriptions of tongue diagnosis in China go back 2,000 years. Thanks to the early adoption of the printing press around 200 BC, medical scrolls were able to be printed on larger scales. They could be found in market scroll stores, and they quickly spread to the far reaches of the empire. Medical texts spread to Korea at this time and were arriving in Japan 600 years later. Chinese characters served as the lingua franca of the medical community throughout East Asia. Rather than being phonetic, like Spanish or Arabic, the characters are pictographic, which makes it possible for people to speak various languages, yet still write relatively similarly. This means that someone could be thinking in any one of the hundreds of Chinese dialects, or even Japanese or Middle Vietnamese, and yet could be writing in a way that was understandable throughout East Asia and across dynasties. Without studying the subject, it's not possible to accurately read English books, even from 500 years ago, and yet the pictographic nature of Chinese characters allows modern Chinese readers to pick up ancient texts with relative fluency. This created more cultural continuity and stability. Copies of medical texts lost or burnt with the fall of a dynasty could easily be reprinted from Vietnam, Japan, or Korea and redistributed due to this shared written language. This created an international medical community spanning diverse biological and cultural landscapes. By the 1300s, China had movable type, and books were starting to get fancy. The Mongolian Yuan dynasty opened up travel throughout the Islamic world, bringing influences from Greco-Arabic and Indian medical systems. The crossroad of medicine opened up in a way it hadn't before. Muslims from Africa, India, and China would meet in Mecca, greatly increasing diffusion of ideas and medical concepts. Au's record of the Golden Mirror featured 36 color illustrations of tongues demonstrating color variations in the tongue body and biofilms. This was likely influenced by Arabic texts and Persian texts at this time, which were using more color illustrations. By the 17th century, there were works devoted exclusively to tongue diagnosis, such as Mirror of the Tongue for cold-induced disorders. 20th century color photographs allowed a much faster teaching method for aspiring doctors. Slideshows of tongue patterns became featured in medical schools throughout East Asia. Automated tongue diagnostic stations began to show up in hospitals. Patients would put their chins on platforms and open wide. The photo could be taken with uniform lighting to reduce variables. By polling experienced doctors, researchers have started to determine more exact metrics which promise to someday provide objective, quantifiable systems. There is growing use of facial recognition technology to assess tongue shape, body, and color. Currently, detection methods are fairly good at determining variations in tongue shape and color, but lack a little bit in specificity when determining the thickness of the tongue's biofilm. Preliminary research has begun on early detection of diabetes, gastrointestinal disorders, and even cancer. In the International Journal of Oncology, Shuan Han et al. Took this method a step further by exploring the tongue microbiome with relation to cancer. The DS01B tongue diagnostic system was used to photograph and analyze the tongue and tongue coating. The next generation sequencing technology was used to examine the ribosomal DNA to investigate the microbiome on the tongue coating. Bioinformatics and statistical methods were used to analyze the microbial community structure and diversity. They found a connection between unhealthy tongue shapes, colors, tongue biofilms, and variations in bacteria. Compared with healthier controls, there was an increase in glossitis, mirror-like tongues in cancer patients. There was also an increase in overall thickness of the tongue as well as the tongue biofilm. While healthier tongues were reddish, those of the cancer patients tended to be more purple. The ribosomal DNA analysis showed differences in microbiota as well. Healthier people were found to have Neisseria haemophilus, Fusobacterium, and Porphyromonas. Cancer patients, by contrast, have been found to have 6 special kinds of microorganisms. To understand tongue diagnosis, we need to go back in history. Not just Chinese history, or even human history. We need to go back long before humans to the world of the adorably fuzzy protozoa. These furry friends love to give hugs with their hair-like cilia. They give their prey a big hug and absorb nutrients through their outer membrane. They wear their stomachs on the outside, eating anything they can, moving along with the help of their hair-like cilia. It's a simple system, and it comes with a pretty big drawback. It's one that you might expect when you wear your stomach on the outside. It becomes a little too easy to ingest environmental toxins. Still, it was the best system we had going for us. Then, one day, a single-celled organism named Gabby, was not really born, but split apart in a very peculiar way. She was formed inside out. Her outer membrane for absorption was now hidden away on the inside. It was terribly embarrassing. Instead of her cilia poking outward around her, they were on the inside. Just imagine being born with your hands inside of you, and you could use them to massage your organs. It was a bizarre existence, but she made the best of it, and she did pretty well. Plus, it did come with some advantages. She had the world's first mouth. It made digestive hugs a bit easier. Her offspring kept going like this, sort of like a microscopic jellyfish. Eventually, one of her weirder offspring, named Kulo, divided off with another freaky adaptation. He was born with an exit. His descendants kept this adaptation, gradually growing longer, sort of like flatworms today. This lengthening paved the way for the development of a spine for vertebrates. As our ancestors mutated into animals, we kept the entrances to our inner endothelium hidden inside our lungs, sinuses, and blood vessels, as well as our gastrointestinal tract. These areas were still fuzzy with cilia, much like the outside of a protozoa. This provided more protection and made selective permeability that much easier. The primordial gases and protozoan soup came along with us for the evolutionary ride, forming our internal ecosystem. The cilia and gases, which once protected the protozoa, were now protecting and communicating from within us. Gasotransmitters, qi, and microbiota. Single-celled organisms rely heavily on an extraordinary gas called nitric oxide to help adapt to the outside world. They use it for tissue repair, obtaining nourishment, and even for self-defense. When encountering a threat, they can release it like an oxidative force field. This has allowed single-celled organisms to maintain their environments and communicate with other microorganisms. It allows them to team up into microbial clans, terraforming their environment and even fighting wars. Nitric oxide also plays a role in signaling symbiotic relationships between microorganisms and with host organisms as well. It's a secondary way that microbes talk to our more human cells and even influence how we think and how we feel. Part of this is because nitric oxide facilitates intracellular communication. This happens from cell to cell and between microorganisms and human cells. When all is well, this helps you maintain immune and hormonal balance. When it's not symbiotic, it can contribute to physical and mental illness. Nitric oxide and gases like it are called gasotransmitters. They are gases with the ability to serve as neurotransmitters. If they're too high or too low, they're associated with disease. but when they are just right, they can help optimize your physical and mental ability. This same class of protective, defensive, nourishing, and interrelating gases at the foundation of life is also the same category of gases found to exit your body's acupuncture points. It's the same class of gases which is boosted when you give someone a qi-nourishing herb such as ginseng. This may be more than a curious coincidence. The word qi, synonymous with traditional Chinese medicine, Tai Chi, and Qigong, literally means gas, and it has an electrochemical relationship with all living things. From plants, protozoa, onto more complex forms of life, nitric oxide and other gasotransmitters form this central metabolic axis. Self-cultivation practices like Tai Chi Chuan, Qigong, yoga, and Zen meditation have demonstrated regulatory activity on nitric oxide. They appear to be literally cultivating gardens of microbiota and nurturing ideal ratios of gasotransmitters. This relationship between gut microbiota and nitric oxide is at the center of every physiological action in the body. It regulates all major systems, and its actions can be seen directly on the tongue. When the old doctors told us that we could understand the body's qi by looking at the tongue, they were not only speaking metaphorically. It turns out they were also accurate from the standpoint of biochemistry. In the next episode, we will continue exploring the tongue and its mysterious biofilm.